Welcome to Veterans Chronicles. I'm Greg Corombos. Our guest in this edition is Frank DeVita, a Coast Guard veteran of World War II in both the European and Pacific theaters. Mr. DeVita crewed one of the boats bringing ground forces ashore at Omaha Beach in the early morning hours of June 6, 1944. Better known, of course, as D-Day. When Frank DeVita heard about the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, he, like millions of other young Americans, immediately went to the nearest recruiting station. And for him, that was in Brooklyn, New York.
I first volunteered for the Air Force as a belly gunner, the gunner. And I took all the tests, and I failed because of peripheral vision. So then I joined the Navy. I passed all the tests they wanted. And they said, fine, come back in 6 weeks. I wanted to go immediately. So next door was the Coast Guard. That's how I became a Coast Guard.
When DeVita's mother found out that he had joined the Coast Guard, she was overjoyed.
And when I joined the Coast Guard, my mother was very happy. She thought I'd be patrolling the beaches on Coney Island. 6 weeks later, I was on my way to Europe.
Instead of being assigned to guard the U.S. coast, he was assigned to the crew of a troop transport ship, the USS Samuel Chase.
My job, originally, I was a gunner's mate. I was in charge of 4 20-millimeter anti-aircraft guns on the stern of the ship. But during invasions, I was on the Higgins boat going into the beach.
Due to the high demand for sailors, the Navy had given the Coast Guard the responsibility of manning the thousands of landing craft that would bring the troops ashore during invasions. Frank DeVita and thousands of other men who had joined the Coast Guard expecting an easier assignment were in for a rude awakening. DeVita deployed with his ship to England in 1943 in preparation for the impending invasion of France. By early June of 1944, after months of training and maneuvers, the time for the invasion had come. Thousands of transport ships and hundreds of warships left ports on the southern coast of England and sailed south toward the coast of France. The invasion target? Normandy. On the night of June 5th, paratroopers from the American 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions and the British 6th Airborne Division began the invasion, landing behind enemy lines in order to cut off German reinforcements from reaching the beaches. Early the next morning, June 6th, Frank DeVita and the men of the fleet woke up and prepared for the main event, the landing.
We had 1,200 troops aboard my ship. From the Big Red One, the 1st Division. And the day of the invasion, we made a big mistake. We fed the troops bacon and eggs and everything you could think of. That was a big mistake. If you know anything about going in battle, the Russians used to go in battle with a hardtack and a glass of water or something like that. We overfed the troops. It was the worst thing we could ever do because they all got seasick, every one of them.
After feeding the troops breakfast, it was time to head to shore. DeVita remembers how he felt when the time for the landing had come.
I was scared because I knew there was going to be a lot of casualties on the beach. And we ended up with 2,000 casualties on my beach, Omaha Beach. We were the worst of the five stars. We were the worst. Omaha Beach was the worst.
There were 5 landing beaches selected by the Allied generals for the invasion. Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches in the east were selected as the British and Canadian landing areas, with Utah and Omaha beaches in the west selected for the Americans. Omaha was the key to the success of the invasion, as it connected the Americans at Utah with the British and Canadians at Gold, Juno, and Sword. If Omaha could not be taken, the other beaches would be cut off, and the Germans would be able to crush each landing in turn. Omaha was also the most heavily defended beach. Overlooking it were bluffs more than 100 feet high, the crests bristling with bunkers, machine guns, artillery, and mortars. Farther below were the beach obstacles. Frank DeVita and the rest of the men that would be responsible for taking Omaha Beach, both Army and Coast Guard, were all about to be witnesses to the worst slaughter of D-Day. DeVita boarded his landing craft around 4 a.m. He and his comrades in the Coast Guard would soon be bringing the first wave of troops ashore, and they knew full well what sort of deadly dangers lay ahead.
At 4 o'clock in the morning, we started dropping our boats in the water. We had 26 Higgins boats. We circled the ship one time, supposed to be good luck, and we headed towards the beaches. We were 11 miles out because the Germans had a gun called the 88, which is the best gun in the war, and had a range of 10 miles. So all the transports were 11 miles out, which is very good for them, not for us, because it took us 2 hours to get to the beach. And in the water, going to the beach, were mines made out of glass or plastic, and you can hardly see them in the water, you know. A couple of boats, not from my ship, but a couple of boats hit the mines, and they got killed.
DeVita still remembers how the soldiers on his boat felt as they approached the enemy coast.
They didn't realize they were going to their death. They were singing and talking and laughing, telling jokes, until they got fired at.
As the landing craft approached the beach, more and more obstacles came into view. The Germans, under the command of Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, had littered the beaches with obstacles designed to sink landing craft, hamper the movement of tanks, and funnel troops into prepared killing zones. DeVita vividly remembers the moments before he dropped the ramp on his Higgins boat and the many horrors he witnessed once he did.
We couldn't get on the beach because there was obstacles in the water. You know, these cross beams with metal. And it was mine. And along the beach, the Germans had 33 machine guns. M42s. It fires 160 rounds per minute. So my job originally, I'm a gunner's mate, so I was supposed to be posting a machine gun on the boat. About 3 or 4 weeks before the invasion, they took my gun away. If you ask me why, I don't know. So consequently, instead of the machine guns, they give me the job of dropping the ramp. You know, in the front of the boat. The boat is made out of wood, but in the front of the boat they have this ramp, like a garage door ramp, and it's made of 2 or 3 inch metal, so it can withstand either a rifle or a machine gun. So when we got close enough to the beach, we only go about 200 yards from the beach. That's the closest we could get. And the machine guns opened fire on us. And the bullets were bouncing off the ramp because it was metal, it was up. But I knew eventually I had to drop the ramp. And then the bullets, instead of hitting the ramp, they would come into the boat. So the coxswain says to me, drop the ramp. I never heard him because the roar of the cannons, 2 big diesel engines in the back of the boat, I never heard him. Then the second time he says to me, drop the ramp. And I froze for a few seconds because I didn't want to die. And I knew once I dropped that ramp, I buzzed. And then he said to me, he says, goddamn DeVita, drop the effing ramp. So I had no choice. I dropped the ramp. The machine guns opened up fire. Killed about 14, 15 troops that were in the front of the boat. Now, where I was, there was a crank that lowered and raised the ramp. I was about 3/4 of the way back. Well, I had soldiers in front of me. They were my pick. They were absorbing the bullets that would come to me, you know. But I had 2 stragglers. They didn't want to die, so they didn't want to get the other troops going forward. They stayed with me. They thought by staying with me, they'd be safe. Unfortunately, by staying with me, they were drawing fire from the hills. They didn't help me. There was 2 guys. One guy was about 4 feet away from me. The other guy was about 2 feet away from me. The first guy got hit, ripped his stomach open. His stomach's outside his belly. Fortunately, he lived. This guy lived. And the other guy that was 2 feet away from me, he was a red-headed kid. The machine gun took his helmet off and part of his brain, a part of it. And he was crying, help me, help me, help me. I had no morphine, I couldn't help him. So he fell at my feet. He fell at my feet and he was crying, help me, help me, help me. I had nothing in my kit to help him. So the only thing I had was the Lord's Prayer. And I started praying, Our Father who art in heaven. I never finished it. Then he slumped down. I knew he was going to die. And I reached down and I squeezed his hand. I want him to know that he wasn't alone. And he died. He died. He was just a little boy. Just a little boy. So then the coxswain says, pick up the ramp because we're getting a lot of flack from the hills and from the machine guns on the beach. So he says to me, raise the ramp. So I pulled the handle, the ramp would not go up. Pulled it a second time, the ramp would not go up. So I put it on auto, wouldn't go up. So my job, there was probably maybe 15 guys still alive on that boat. My job was to protect these guys with the ramp. So I couldn't see the ramp from where I was because of all the dead bodies in front of me. So I had to do something I didn't want to do. I was crawling over the dead bodies and asking for them forgiveness. They were dead. And I'm saying, I'm sorry, I'm sorry. So I climbed over the dead bodies and I started going through the ramp. And all of a sudden, one guy came out. I don't know if he was a crew member or Army. I didn't care, so I had some help. So when we got to close enough to the beach, I wanted to know why the ramp wouldn't go up. There was 2 dead soldiers. They never got out of the boat. They were on the ramp. Plus the weight of the soldiers. And each soldier had 90 pounds on his backpack, so the ramp would not go up. So this other guy and myself, I pointed to his belt, and we grabbed his belt, and by step, we pulled him into the 2 boys that were dead, into the boat. Then he says to me, raise the ramp. So without the 2 guys, when I had it on autopilot, it came up by itself anyhow. So, the Germans are very diabolical. They know how to kill people. Besides the mines and the machine guns, they're telephone poles. On top of the telephone pole was a mine. It wasn't screwed in or nailed in. It was just sitting there. So if you happen to tap the telephone pole, that mine would come in your boat. We were scared of the telephone poles. So anyhow, the coxswain was with me. He was a little kid from Brooklyn, New York, Durham. And he got out of it, because don't forget, he had to go backwards through these mines, through these telephone poles. He turned the boat around, and we started heading towards my boat. My captain was very smart, which each wave, he came a little closer to the shore, a little closer to the shore. So we headed for my boat, my ship rather, and then we saw this white ship with a big red cross on it. It's a hospital ship. So instead of going to our ship, we went to the hospital ship, because we had a lot of wounded aboard, badly wounded. And when we got to the hospital ship, there was a ramp on the back. And 2 guys from the hospital ship, God bless them, They jumped into my boat. And they did something we couldn't do. They were peeling the dead off to get to the wounded. I don't remember exactly. I was like in a little shock at that time. I don't remember if they got 5, 6, I don't know how many. But they got these guys and they put them in a hospital ship. At least they were going to live. They had wheelchairs, they had morphine, they had everything on the hospital ship. I was happy that these guys are going to get all the care they needed. So then these 2 guys jumped out of the boat. We pulled it away from the hospital ship, and we headed towards my ship. On the back of my ship, they had dropped a sled. A sled is like a garage door, a big garage door. And we would put the dead and wounded on there, and then the crank would take them on board ship. So somebody yelled through a klaxon horn, I want 1 man from each boat to come up to be interviewed, or not interviewed, because he figured maybe we could help the next wave. So I got aboard the sled and I went up and I was interviewed by a Navy guy and a big Army guy. That guy had hands as big as a baseball mitt. And he did something, like I said, I was just shocked. He did something, he tapped me on the shoulder. He said, "It's all right. It's all right, son." It was like a hug. Just like a hug. So I was interviewed with him. And then this Army guy said to me, he says, "Son, let me teach you something." He said, "Those machine guns can only fire for so long. Then they burn, they get hot. And they got to change the barrels. When they change the barrels, that's when you drop the ramp." So I said to him, "How much time do I have?" 2 to 3 seconds to change the barrel. So that's what I did. So then, after I was interviewed, see, my boat already had pulled away to 28. So I'm waiting for another boat. And I'm standing on deck, and nobody's around me because I stunk to high heaven. My uniform was covered with blood and puke. So I'm standing by myself, and I said to myself, do I want to go back into the belly of the beast and face those machine guns? I didn't want to die. So I thought about it for a while, and I said to myself, if I don't go, they're going to send a replacement. Suppose the replacement gets killed. How could I live with myself? So I made up my mind, I'm going back. And I went back 14 more times. I made 15 trips altogether. The Germans owned the beach. The Germans owned the beach, not us. And they were slaughtering the troops left and right, from the hills and from the ground. These poor guys, they had no chance. You know, it was flat like a pool table. No place to hide. You can't dig in sand. And they were getting killed so fast. So, like I said, I was in a little bit of a shock.
Thanks to Coast Guardsmen like Frank DeVita, thousands of American troops made it ashore on Omaha Beach. However, those who survived the initial torrent of bullets and advanced across the beach were still unable to scale the bluffs beyond the beach. Thousands of men from the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions were pinned to the ground behind a small sand embankment called the Shingle. If the German guns atop the ridge could not be silenced, none of the men taking cover behind the Shingle would make it off Omaha Beach alive. DeVita and the men on board the ships offshore looked on at the carnage, unable to help, until one brave skipper of a destroyer hatched a plan.
There was 5 destroyers all along, but the lead destroyer was the Frankfurt. And then 1 or 2 other destroyers. The Satellite was there and the McGook. So the 3 of them came in at the same time. When you attack an enemy, you attack his nose because there's a smaller silhouette. He did that, and he came so close to shore. You know, our boats can go on the beach. A destroyer has a keel. They can't get too close. He was in sand. So then he did something I've never seen done before. This guy was willing to sacrifice his life and his boat and all his men because he wanted to help these guys on the beach. So he took his boat that was facing this way and he turned it sideways, exposing his beam to the 88s. The reason he did that, a destroyer has 4 5-inch guns. He wanted to fire these 5-inch guns at one time. Now the guys up on the hill that were facing us, they had machine guns, 88s up there. We couldn't see them, they were in the grass, foliage and stuff like that. So he put a round of his 5-inch guns, 4 at a time, and he took out those guys on the slope. And right then there, the battle started changing.
One by one, the German guns began to fall silent. However, the battle for Omaha Beach was not yet won. Small groups of American troops began scaling the bluffs, all the while dodging a torrent of German machine gun and rifle fire. After hours of brutal combat, the German beach defenses gradually fell to the American forces. As the battle on shore began to move away from the beach, DeVita and the Coast Guardsmen had even more difficult work to do.
By the 5th wave, we ran out of troops. So we started taking the 29th Division, because the 29th Division was on Utah, and Utah at that time was clean. So they swung over to help the 1st Division. That's the first 5. We ran out of troops, and we had to do something else. Instead of going into the beach, we started to take the dead and the wounded off the beach. We had to get in the water. I weighed 125 pounds. I couldn't lift one of these guys up. So 2 or 3 of us we got. And we put them in the boat. We started going back to my ship. Now, I don't know how many wounded we took to my ship, but I do know that we took 308 dead bodies. Why do I know that? Because I had a good friend of mine, John Ola, who was a quartermaster, and his job was to put the bodies in the body bags, and he dispensed 308 dead body bags.
The battle for Omaha Beach ultimately claimed the lives of more than 2,400 American servicemen. But by the end of the day, more than 34,000 troops had landed on the beach and advanced inland. Securing the Omaha beachhead proved vital to the ultimate success of D-Day, and it was men like Frank DeVita who brought the soldiers ashore. After the landings were complete, DeVita and his boat returned to their ship.
They brought my boat up. I don't remember what boat it was because the 28 was gone. They brought my boat up, and I looked at that boat. It looked like Swiss cheese. The machines had decimated it. And I'm saying to myself, how the hell did anybody live off that boat, right? So I got aboard aboard the ship, yeah. And I'm waiting. I'm waiting. And the captain was so good for it. His name was Captain Frisch. He understood what we had gone through. So after we took these 300 dead bodies and the wounded, I don't know how many wounded we were. When I'm aboard the ship and we're going towards Southampton, I'm all by myself, they announced over the loudspeaker, there's cheese sandwiches and coffee for the crews that went into the beach. So everybody went down to the mess hall. I didn't want to go. First of all, I stunk to heaven, high heaven. And I didn't want him to see my cry. I wanted to see me cry. So I walked back to my 20mm guns, and I sat down, and I'm reflecting. And I said to myself, what the hell just happened? And how come I'm still alive? How come I'm still alive? So it was a wet deck. It was probably 10, 11 o'clock. I forget the time. And I'm all alone. And I looked around to see if any of my mates were with me. Nobody was there. But when I turned around, all the dead bodies, the 308 dead bodies, like a cord of wood, I started to cry. And I cried myself to sleep. And the next morning when we pulled into Southampton, somebody tapped me on the shoulder. I think it was Lieutenant Gruber, I'm not sure. He said, DeVita, get up. We have to unload the dead and the wounded.
Frank DeVita and the USS Samuel Chase never returned to Normandy. But his wartime service had only just begun. Coming up on Veterans Chronicles, we'll detail the rest of DeVita's service, much of it half a world away, against a different enemy. This is Veterans Chronicles. I'm Greg Corombos. This week we're sharing the story of Frank DeVita, a Coast Guard veteran of World War II who served in both the European and Pacific theaters, and crewed a Higgins boat at Omaha Beach in the early hours of June 6, 1944. After taking Allied troops ashore on D-Day, Frank DeVita and the crew of the USS Samuel Chase shipped out to the Mediterranean. In August of 1944, DeVita helped bring troops ashore in the much lesser-known invasion of southern France, codenamed Operation Dragoon. These landings were much less brutal than D-Day, as the majority of the German troops in France had been moved north to hold off the Allies in Normandy. On one beach, Allied troops were greeted not by gunfire, but by an old Frenchman who was giving out bottles of fresh wine to the soldiers. After Operation Dragoon, DeVita thought he was going home, but the military had other plans.
After all the horror of the two invasions in France, we thought we were going home. Then the announcer of the loudspeakers, get your gear in order, we're going to the Pacific. And I didn't make the actual invasion of the Philippine Islands, but we did bring replacement troops into the Philippines. So we got credit for an invasion.
In October of 1944, General Douglas MacArthur and the American 6th Army landed on Leyte in the Philippines as part of the Pacific island hopping campaign. As American forces inched closer and closer to Japan, the fighting grew in brutality both on land and at sea, where the Japanese deployed a new weapon, the kamikaze.
And then from there, we went up to Okinawa. And I was in Okinawa when the kamikazes came over. And the kamikazes were sinking boat after boat. They didn't want my boat. My boat was only a transport. They wanted the destroyers and the aircraft carriers.
While the brutal fighting on Okinawa itself raged for nearly 3 months, from April until June 1945, kamikazes inflicted huge casualties on the supporting fleet. 4,907 American sailors were killed during the Okinawa campaign, almost all of them as a direct result of kamikaze attacks, making the battle for Okinawa the deadliest battle in U.S. Navy history. Fortunately, Frank DeVita made it out unscathed.
So after the kamikazes left, I had there twice. When the kamikaze twice, I was there. Then we went back to Pearl Harbor. And on the way to Pearl Harbor, we hit a coral reef. and we put a 17-foot gash in the hull of the ship. You know, the Titanic, the reason he sank, they didn't close the hatches. So our guys, especially trained for that, they closed the hatches on this one place where the water was coming in. And the boat was tilting like this. So they gave us 2 destroyers to get as far as the Philippines, because the Philippines had a dry dock. And they took our ship, put it in the dry, we had to wait our turn. They put it in the dry dock and they put a patch. They couldn't put the whole hull up. So we left there and we started to come to Pearl. We went to Pearl and the destroyers were still with us. And after Pearl, we started going home to the United States. And we went to San Diego. So I had a friend of mine who lived right near the shipyard. And I said to him, I'm gonna go AWOL, but I want you to call me. If they come out of dry dock, I'll come back. So the train didn't leave from San Diego, it left from San Francisco. So I took a bus to to San Francisco. I got on the troop train that was going to the United States, called the Silver Streak. All Army guys and Navy guys, a lot of them wounded, had no papers, but thankfully nobody asked for papers. So I get home, I run to my house was about a mile and a half from the subway where I got off. I ran all the way home, I wanted to see my mother. My father was at work. My brother was away. My kid brother was in school. I didn't know what to do. So I went next door. The woman's name was Mrs. Barsha. And I said, Mrs. Barsha, where's my mother? Have something to eat. You know, I'll tell you, so have something to eat. I said, no, I can't. Where's my mother? She's at the church rolling bandages. So I ran to the church. It was about a mile and a half away. And I opened the door, it was like a big gymnasium. And I'm facing these women. They were in a big circle. My mother had her back to me. But the people who were looking at me, they were going like that, you know. My mother didn't know what was going on. She turned around, she saw me, fainted it away. I thought I killed my mother. I killed my mother. So anyhow, we went home. My mother called the whole army. Frank is home, Frank is home, Frank is home. So I'm home for 2 weeks. You know, you don't get 2 weeks leave. My father was in the Army in the First World War. He said to me, he says, you know, you're home a long time. Let me see your papers. I said, Pop, I don't have any papers. I'm AWOL. Get in the car, took me to Grand Central Station. First train back to San Francisco. I had to wait for the first train. So I'm waiting for the train with my father. And there was 2 MPs. My father walks over to the MPs. He said, you see that kid over there? That's my son. He's AWOL, but he's going back. He threw me on the train, under the bus. My own father. So the MPs came over, and he says, this is what we're going to do. When the train comes in, if you're on the train, we won't do anything. If you don't get on the train, we're going to pull you in. I got on the train. It was still in the dry dock. I went back to my ship. And that's the end of my story.
After going AWOL, Frank DeVita and the USS Samuel Chase sailed back into the Pacific, this time to Japan itself, as part of the occupation forces. It was in that assignment that he found something in common with the Japanese people.
I was in the occupation of Japan for about 8 months. When I was in Japan, a little Japanese woman, about 5 feet tall, She walked up to me. First they bow like this. And then she says, I want to thank you. I said, why are you thanking me? She said, the war's over. You know, it's the big people who make wars, not the common people. They're the ones who get hurt.
Even now, 77 years later, the memories of DeVita's time in combat still haunt him.
And let me tell you something. If somebody in battle says they weren't scared, they were scared. They're lying. You gotta be scared. You know, I was on the boat with the machine guns. I had machine guns, bullets, like a swarm of angry bees. One guy went down, the other guy went down. Is the next one mine? You're scared? I relive it every day of my life. Not the other battles, but D-Day was the worst. I mean, when I left after the 15th trip in, there was 2,000 dead bodies on the beach. 2,000. You gotta be scared. Anybody tells you they're not scared, they're lying.
And Frank DeVita still remembers the men he saw on Omaha Beach all those years ago. And he says those who paid the ultimate price there deserve the greatest honor.
I'm not a hero. A lot of people call me a hero. I'm not a hero. I'm a survivor. There's a cemetery up in France, in Normandy. Omaha Beach overlooks the cemetery. In that cemetery is 9,400 kids in the ground. Those are my heroes. They gave their life for their country. They were my heroes.
Frank DeVita is a veteran of the U.S. Coast Guard and a veteran of World War II in both the European and Pacific theaters. He crewed one of the landing crafts in the early, horrific moments of D-Day off Omaha Beach. I'm Greg Corombos, and this is Veterans Chronicles. Hi, this is Greg Corombos, and thanks for listening to Veterans Chronicles, a presentation of the American Veterans Center. For more information, please visit AmericanVeteransCenter.org. You can also follow the American Veterans Center on Facebook, and on Twitter, we're at AVC Update. Subscribe to the American Veterans Center YouTube channel for full oral histories and special features, and of course, please subscribe to the Veterans Chronicles podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks again for listening, and please join us next time for Veterans Chronicles.